What's up everyone, Subterranean here, and today we're going to learn how to make this bass. This is a dubstep bass with a metallic sound similar to artists like Barely Alive. So, we're going to start out by turning off these external effects because we won't need these until later. And now we're going to open up Serum, and we'll initialize the patch so we have a blank slate to work with. Now, I'm going to go over to Oscillator A, and I'm going to select Basic Shapes from the Analog category. And I'm going to do the same thing for Oscillator B. And before I go any further in this tutorial, I would like to let you guys know that in the description box below, we'll have a link where you can download the full Ableton project file, along with the Serum preset. So if you don't have Ableton, you can throw the preset into Serum and add some extra effects and you'll be good. So we're going to go over to Oscillator A. We'll put the wavetable position on 3, so we've got a triangle. For Oscillator B, we'll set this to be a saw wave, so put that on 2. And now on Oscillator B, let's take the level and set that all the way down at 0%. And if you've seen some Serum tutorials before, you might know where we're going with this. We're going to be using FM on this bass. And remember, when you're doing frequency modulated basses or any other kind of FM sounds in Serum, you don't want to turn off the other oscillator, or else the FM won't work. You just want to leave it muted with the oscillator on. So put the level at 0% and leave Oscillator B turned on. Let's go over to the warp menu for Oscillator A. So just click right here and select FM from B. And now let's play with the knob and see if we can get a good sound. You can start to hear the saw wave come in a little bit more at 48%, so we'll go with that. To get a more metallic tone for our bass, let's go over to Oscillator B, and we're going to set the octave to be up a bit. We could do +1, or maybe +2. I like +2 better. We'll go with that. And let's also go to the semi, and we'll put it up 7 semitones. This adds a nice contrast to the lower end of the bass. This is where you really get that nice metallic dubstep sound. Now I'm going to go over to LFO1. We're going to throw this onto the warp mode. And let's just take the modulation and push it back a bit, because right now it sounds pretty annoying. So we'll just click and drag. I like it better at 16 right here, so we'll leave it there. Let's also go over to the level for Oscillator A. We'll put this all the way down at 0%, and we'll throw LFO1 onto the level so we can modulate the volume of the entire sound. I'm going to turn this down a bit so it doesn't clip when we put effects on later. About 70 should be good. Right around here. Now, let's go over to LFO1 and change the shape, because the default shape is kind of boring and it's not doing a lot for me. I already created a new LFO shape just for this sound, and I saved it, so I'm going to select that right now. It's called New Bass 1 right here. I'm going to slow the rate down to 1 second, and I'm going to set the mode to be trigger, so this pattern replays every time we play a note. I'm also going to set the voicing to be mono and legato, so we don't have any overlapping notes. And I'm also going to go over to LFO2. I'm going to leave the shape as the default one, but I'm just going to set the rate at 1 second. We're not going to be using LFO1 for a whole lot of things, just for a few basic modulations later on. And we might as well also set the mode for LFO2 to be on trigger as well. Now that we've got all that set up, let's go over to the filter so we can start to shape this sound a little bit more. Let's just turn the filter on, and I'm going to set this to be a reverb filter under the miscellaneous category right here. And I'm going to play with the cutoff, and let's see if we can get a good sound out of this. We're starting to get a good sound at around 36 Hz right here. So we'll leave it there. I'm also going to set the resonance down to 0%, so we don't get too much of a feedback type sound. I'm going to go over to the drive. We'll leave the drive at 0, but let's throw LFO1 onto the drive and modulate it slightly for a little bit more grit. So we'll just take LFO1, drag that onto the drive, and this is going to sound really loud with it all the way up, so let's scale that back. I think it sounds good at 6, just to add a little bit more clarity and punch to the sound. Now this sound is a little bit stagnant so far, so I'm going to go over to LFO2, and I'm going to use this for a little bit of subtle modulation. Let's take LFO2 and drag that onto the cutoff of our reverb filter. And that doesn't sound very good, so I'm going to scale this back to be at a very small level because, like I said, we just want a little bit of modulation to keep this sound from being stagnant. Right about here at 2 should be good. It creates a pretty cool effect because it almost sounds like the sound is going up and down in pitch, but it's really just the filter doing that. So now our sound is actually starting to resemble a good metallic dubstep bass, but it's still pretty plain and vanilla. So let's go over to the effects to spice things up. And right off the bat, I'm going to turn my master down a bit just so we don't clip accidentally. The first effect we're going to throw on is going to be a distortion. We'll set this to be the first effect in the rack. And I'm going to set this to be a hard clip. Now let's turn up the drive and see if we can get a nice sound. We'll start at about 51%. Let's take LFO1 and drag that onto the drive. And now we're going to scale back the modulation so it doesn't get too distorted. About 29 should be good right there. The next effect is going to be hyperdimension. This one's going to come after the distortion, but before the other effects. And right off the bat, I'm going to just take the mix and scale it back a bit because as it is, this sound is just too saturated. So let's take the mix and scale that back. I like it right about here at 36%. I'm going to go over to the dimension. We'll put the mix a bit higher. About 22 or 23% should be good. And we'll scale back the size. You want something pretty small here, so let's go way down to the left. We'll go for 7%. That sounds pretty good right there. Now I'm going to go over to the delay. We're going to put this up after the hyperdimension and the distortion. But before these other effects, I'm going to turn BPM off, and I'm going to turn link on, so the left and right channels have the same delay time. And what we're going to be doing here is a very common technique that sounds really cool with a lot of dubstep basses. We're going to have a very fast delay rate, where it repeats the sound in a very fast speed, and it creates a tone. So let's start by putting the feedback up so we have more of a noticeable delay echo sound. I like it at about 60% right there. We don't want the delay to be too loud, so we'll go over to the mix and we'll scale that back a bit to about 21% right there. And now I'm going to go over to the delay speed. We can use either the left or the right. It doesn't matter because they both control each other. And I'm going to put this at a much faster value. It will go for about 5.99, right there. Now I'm going to take alpha 1. We can throw that onto either the left or the right rate right here. We'll just throw this onto either one. And with the modulation at a very high rate, we create some pretty cool glitchy sounds. This might be useful for another type of sound or bass, but We don't want that for this particular sound, so we're going to scale the modulation way back. We'll go for 9 right here. That's just enough modulation to make a little bit of a difference. Next, we're going to turn on a phaser. Let's set the rate to be down at 0 Hz, so we've got a totally static phaser we can control with our LFO instead of a BPM or a fixed rate. Let's also set the depth down to be at 0%, and the frequency can stay at 600 Hz. That should be pretty good. But we're going to go over to LFO2 again, and we'll throw that onto the frequency knob. And once again, we'll scale that modulation back quite a bit. It sounds pretty good at 18, right there. And with the phaser on 100% mix right here, it sounds like the sound's being played underwater, and that's not what we want. We want just a little bit of phaser. So once again, we're going to scale the mix back. 37% should be good. The next effect we're going to add on is going to be a filter. We're going to turn that on, and we'll set this to be after the phaser and before these other effects right here. And we're going to set this to be an HN12 to add some more modulation and some frequency sweeping to this sound. Let's go over to LFO1 and we'll drag this onto the cutoff. So we've got a little modulation curve like this. And I'm going to go over and we'll tweak this modulation to make it a little bit more subtle, because as it is, it's kind of a cool sound, but it's way too in your face and it's taking out too many frequencies. So we're going to scale that back. I think about 50 should be good, but it's still taking out too many frequencies and it's leaving the sound pretty dry. So we'll go over to the cutoff and we'll throw this down. We can probably go for about maybe 50 or 49 Hertz. That should be good. Let's also go over to the resonance and we'll boost this up a bit to give our frequency sweeping a little bit more presence. We can go for about 12% there. Let's also turn the drive up to give this sound a little bit more crunch. And now you can see and hear why we needed to turn the master down, because once you've got a lot of modulation, stuff just starts to get really loud. Let's also go back over to the drive. We'll take LFO1 and we'll throw that on there for just a little bit more modulation. And I can already tell that this is going to be way too loud, so let's take the modulation and scale that back a lot. I think we can go for about 21 right there. Let's go over to the filter. We're going to set this to be at 57%, and we're going to be doing even more frequency sweeping with this knob, just for a bit more modulation. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to take LFO1, we'll throw that onto the frequency knob, and let's push it back to do some backwards modulation. So just click, and then drag backwards. And you can hear that we're getting even more modulation from this. We're starting to get a nice tone at about -40. -40 or -41, that sounds pretty good. The next effect we're going to throw on is going to be an EQ. We'll click on that and then we'll drag it to be after the filter and before the compressor or the chorus. And the filter removed a lot of the high frequencies and left this bass sounding a little bit dull, so we're going to remedy that with this EQ. I'm only going to use this second EQ band right here. We're going to be using the little high boost right here. And I'm going to turn our gain up so we can start bringing the high end of this sound back. I think we can probably go for about 7 dB right here. That sounds pretty good. Let's also go over to the frequency, and we'll push this further to the right because we don't want to boost the mid end of the sound too much. We only want the high end. I think we can go for about right here, maybe 3,205 Hertz. And we can leave the Q as it is. The last effect we're going to add on inside of Serum is going to be a compressor, and we're going to click on multiband, set this to be a multiband compressor, and now we're going to turn the gain up, and we're going to really hear a huge difference in this sound. I think we can go for about 11 dB on the gain, and you can hear the multiband compressor is really doing a good job of making this sound more aggressive and full. So we've got the main core elements of this sound down, but you may be wondering why it doesn't sound quite as full as the sound that I played earlier. Well, we've still got a couple more things to do. The last thing we need to do inside of Serum that I actually forgot about, silly me, is to go back into the oscillator tab, and we're going to need to turn up the amount of voices on both oscillators A and B to give more of a full and thick sound to this bass. Let's go over to the unison for oscillator A. We're going to turn this up to be 5 voices. And you can already hear that this sound is more full and thick, and it has more stereo presence because we've got more voices playing at the same time. But one of the problems with this is that now we've got the sound playing a bit different each time and having different stereo phases. So to fix this, we'll go down to the phase, we'll put this down at 0, and we'll do the same thing for the random knob. We'll put this down at 0%. So now the same sound is playing with the same stereo phase every time. Let's also push the detune knob down a bit, down to the left, because if you have the detune too high, your bass starts to sound really funky and weird. So let's go over to the detune, and we'll just push that back. And it sounds pretty good at about 0.10 or 0.9, right there. Let's also do the same thing for oscillator B. We'll just go over to the unison tab. Let's also increase this to 5 voices. We'll go over to the phase and the random knobs, and we'll push those down to 0 like we did with oscillator A. And we'll push this detune knob back. I think it sounds pretty good right here at 0.13. So now we've got a much thicker and full sound for our bass with a heavier stereo presence. And before we move on to our external effects, there's one little trick I would like to show you guys inside of Serum. Let's go over to the global tab, and I'm going to go over to the width, and we'll turn this down a bit, because sometimes you might not want that full stereo presence to your bass. You might only want a little bit of stereo just to spice things up. So you can hear that with the width at 100, the bass is fully in stereo, and if we put it down at 0, the bass has been converted to be fully mono. So let's find a good middle ground. I'm going to push this little button up so it controls both the left and the right channels. And I think we're good at about 56 or 57. That gives us just enough stereo information in our bass. And finally, we're going to wrap up this tutorial by throwing on some external effects. This sound is pretty good as it is, but once we throw on these effects, it's going to become even better. The first effect we're going to add might seem like an odd one at first. We're going to throw on a gate. So just go over to your audio effects and then drag on a gate. The reason why we're using a gate here is because we're going to add even more compression to this sound. We already threw on a multiband compressor inside of Serum, and we're going to add another one in just a few minutes. Sometimes when you're over-compressing your basses, you're going to run into weird audio issues where you have feedback noises at the end of your bass. So to get rid of that, we're going to need to add a gate before we add on the extra compression. So let's take the threshold and we'll put this down a bit so the bass has some room to breathe. You can hear when we put the threshold knob down lower, it lets our bass signal come in cleaner. And we don't want this knob to be too high. We want it to be just low enough so it catches those weird feedback sounds. So I think we can put it on about maybe negative 45 or 44 dB. That should work right there. I'm also going to take our floor and put that down to negative infinite dB. And the next effect we're going to add on is going to be a reverb. So we'll just take that and drag it onto our track right here. And we're going to have a very small, subtle reverb, because remember, after this, we're going to have some more compression. And what the compression is going to do is it's going to over-exaggerate the reverb and make it sound a lot more strong. So we're going to want a very small reverb so it gets over-exaggerated and it sounds more natural. I'm going to go over to input processing. We'll turn low cut on and leave high cut on. And we'll just make a little bandpass curve. You don't need to be super accurate with this. Just do something like this, a little shape right here. I'm going to turn the chorus off. We don't really need that. And I'm going to go over to our decay time, and I'm going to put it on something a bit more manageable. I think we can go for maybe around 400 milliseconds. We'll go for 432 milliseconds, right there. And we'll also take the dry wet, and we'll put that down to something much more manageable as well. About 11% should be good, right about there. And finally, we're going to wrap up this bass completely by throwing on a multiband dynamics, and we're going to go for the OTT preset. So let's just drag that on, and here we have our sound. And you can hear that the OTT preset did a great job of really overcompressing the sound and making it sound huge. And now I'm going to show you guys why we need the gate. If we turn the gate off and then we play a note with our sound, you hear those weird noises that happen at the end of our bass? They don't sound very nice, so that's why you need the gate. And that gets rid of all of the unwanted feedback. And there we have our sound. If you're wondering how I made this little variation on the bass right here, all I did was I went back into Serum, and I switched up the LFO1 and LFO2 curves a little bit. LFO2 is playing faster, and LFO1 just has a different curve right here, just a different shape, but otherwise it's the same sound. So that was my tutorial, and if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe to the Bass Gorilla channel.